My name is Morten Elvang. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. And this afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome Karl Scotland, who will talk about the X matrix and the taste framework, but also, I hope, offer your comments on where you see strategy going and how you can work yourself into that. And we will follow the normal format with about 30 minutes for Karl, and then after that, open conversation and discussion. So please, Karl.
Thank you. And so let me share my slides. I don't think I'm going to even talk for 30 minutes. I've tried to keep my slides down to a bare minimum. So we'll see how this works. Um, so yeah, I'm going to talk about the X matrix as a template, the taste framework which the X matrix is built upon. But really, actually, it's trying to make this is all about trying to make strategy visible to people. So this is a phrase that I've been doing some work with Jim Benson recently and working with him on this. So rather than it just being um, a framework on its own or a tool, a template on its own, trying to understand, well, why are we using this tool? And it's about that visual management aspect of it and applying that to strategy. So I'm not going to talk about strategy in terms of what I think a good strategy is and strategy development. But I'm going to talk about what's I guess from the lean community called strategy deployment or Hoshinkanri. I prefer just to talk about strategy deployment, avoid too many Japanese terms that people don't like or don't understand. Um, and this is the way I've been, or for a long time, been defining strategy deployment. So any transformation approach where the solutions emerge from the people closest to the problem. And it's kind of nice having Dave on the call because I think this was probably partly inspired by either Dave or it might have been Michael Chevel Dave when I was doing some work with him at Cisco. But this idea that we want the ideas and the solutions that that we use in transformations to come from those that have the most information and the most the experiences of what's working and what's not working, rather than being a kind of predefined solution that some consultants come in and impose on people, inflict on people, or maybe just kind of get handed down from the top of the organization. So I find that there's lots of bodies of knowledge, there's lots of ideas out there that I kind of take and use and merge. And I'm not trying necessarily to define a process. I don't think there's a single right way of doing this, but I think we can kind of describe a general approach as strategy deployment. I kind of updated this definition recently because it occurred to me that and kind of listening, I think I was listening to a podcast with Jay Bloom on it, where he was talking about kind of referring to ACOF and the idea of messes. So we don't really have nice, neat problems to which we can apply nice, neat solutions, but we have messes. So entangled problems that all kind of fit together, mix together. And what we're trying to do is untangle that mess of problems. So I kind of played around with updating the wording of this and kind of came up with an updated definition of strategy deployment. So any transformation approach where the propositions emerge from the people closest to the the context. So the idea there that, yeah, there's not a single problem, but there's this context, which is the mess of problems. And we're not trying to come up with a known solution to any of those problems, but actually it's propositions for ideas or hypotheses or suggestions that we might want to try, which we think is going to improve the context. So just trying to get away from that kind of nice, neat solution problem language into propositions and ideas, and from the people that are closest to the context. So that's kind of strategy deployment. So that's the general topic, I guess, that I'm kind of talk about and I'm kind of interested in at the moment. And I think about and I kind of call these attributes. So what makes a good strategy deployment approach? What do I look for? The first is being outcome oriented. So focusing on outcomes rather than solutions. So we're not just trying to come in with a predefined solution and implement that solution, but having an idea about what a good outcome would look like, and then being oriented towards that outcome rather than being driven by a specific outcome. So by outcomes, I'm not kind of talking about tangible kind of solutions and things that we're going to implement, but rather it's a sense of direction. So strategy deployment, we have a sense of direction, and while as we're trying to improve through the transformation, we want to be moving towards an outcome, but not trying to implement that outcome. So outcome oriented is the first attribute. Second one, then, continuous transformation. So rather than treating a transformation as a predefined one-off project that you implement a solution and it's done, this idea that we're constantly changing, we're constantly learning, we're constantly trying new things, hopefully do things that will move us towards our outcome. So it's this idea that rather than I'm working agile transformations, the agile transformation is you're going to come in, implement a new process, and you're done. Rather, it's we're going to come in, we're going to try to make some changes, see what things make things better, try and spot what things might make things worse, amplify the positive things, kind of get rid of the things that are not so good. And you're constantly doing that. And trying to help organizations learn how to do that rather than the idea of, we're not giving them a fish, we're trying to teach them how to fish. And then the last one is engaging everyone everywhere. So that idea of getting ideas from everyone in the organization. So all breadths of the organization, all levels and depths of the organization. It's not just the consultants that come in. It's not just a central leadership group that decides these things. We really want a diversity of ideas and to be including everyone in the transformation process. So we're getting as many perspectives and as much creativity as possible. So those are three high-level attributes. And then that leads to the TASTE framework. So this is a framework that I've come up with, which will lead into the X matrix. But these are 5 core elements that I look for when we're talking about strategy and I'm working with organizations on a strategic transformation. So first is the T is the true north. So this is the orientation that informs what we should do. So this kind of ties back to that idea of being outcome oriented. The true north, again, it's not a destination. The true north as a metaphor is a direction we're trying to go in. The other similar one is the North Star. And when people are navigating by the North Star, they're not trying to get to the North Star as a destination. If you're navigating by true north, you're not trying to get to the North Pole, but it helps you decide, are you heading in the right direction? So true north is something, it's kind of statement that gets everybody aligned to when we're making decisions about what we're doing and whether things are working, we can say, is this moving us towards our true north or is this moving us away from our true north? So true north, then aspirations, I describe as the results we hope to achieve. So they're not targets, they're not they're measures, but they're not things that we have to achieve. That's results, but not targets. The way I describe this is when we get to the end of the year and we look back on the year, how are we going to judge ourselves? How are we going to know whether we've achieved what we want to achieve? Those are our aspirations. I think aspirations is I took some of that language from Roger Martin and his Playing to Win. He talks about aspirations there as well. So it's being a little bit more specific and a little bit more closer in terms of a time horizon that helps people understand what does success look like, and what's the size of our aspirations? What's the level of our aspirations? We have big aspirations, or are they relatively small aspirations? Then we get into strategies themselves. So guiding policies that enable choice. So strategies not as plans that we're going to implement, but the idea of guiding policies comes from Rommel's strategy kernel. So he describes strategies as things having a good strategy is having a diagnosis, a guiding policies, and a coherent action. And kind of taking that idea of guiding policies that help people choose what to do, but don't necessarily tell people what to do specifically and directly. So even overstatements, I think, are a nice template and way of describing strategies where we're saying we're going to make a trade-off and we're going to choose to do focus on A even over focusing on B. Even though B might be a good thing to do, we're making that trade-off, we're making that decision. So strategies as guiding policies that enable choice. And then we have tactics. So this is the coherent action, going back to Rummel's strategy kernel. Tactics are the coherent actions that we're going to take. What are we going to do? What investments we're going to make? And I usually kind of talk about this in terms of what hypotheses do we want to test, or what experiments do we want to run, or what sort of probes do we want to act on. And then the last one is evidence, outcomes that will indicate progress. So if our aspirations are our lagging measures and tell us whether we have been successful, our evidence are leading indicators that tell us whether we think that we're making progress towards meeting our aspirations. So deliberately use the word evidence as a way, again, of measures. I think evidence can be non-metric. It could be things things we want to see more of or hear more of, but we should be something that's going to indicate that we can look at to say, are we doing the right thing? Are our tactics working? Are we likely to meet our aspirations? Are our strategies working even? So you've got those 5 elements in the taste metric framework, and then we can visualize those very simply like this. So we have our true north. True north informs our aspirations and those results we hope to achieve. We achieve those aspirations and they're enabled by our strategies. Our strategies are implemented by our tactics. Our tactics hopefully will generate some evidence, and then that evidence was hopefully evidence of us achieving our aspirations. So there's relationships between these different elements. And then we can fit that onto the X matrix. So this is where the X matrix comes into it as a template. We have true north in the middle, tactics on the top, aspirations on the bottom, strategies on the left, and evidence on the right. And we have there's matrices in the corner. So this is why it's called the X matrix, because these matrices form an X. And they start showing us the relationships between the different elements in the taste framework. So this isn't a nice mechanical process where we say we'll implement this strategy just with this tactic, and this tactic will just generate this bit of evidence. It's a many-to-many relationship. So what we're looking for is coherence. Do all these things fit together in a coherent way? Do we understand the correlations between them and how they might contribute to each other? But it's not, and there's no any direct causation in there. It's really just trying to look at it, and to steal some more of Dave's language, I think of this as messy coherence. You don't necessarily want everything to map to everything else, and it's not always going to be nice and neat. So we can visualize that coherence with dots in the matrices. So this is it's kind of a simplified and genericized example. But we had for a previous customer, we had the true north of instantaneous development and deployment. So customer makes a request, we can make a small change and develop it, deploy it. The customer gets the benefit instantaneously. So something which kind of really gave us some guided us in terms of what we were trying to achieve with the transformation. Aspirations then around, we wanted to be able to release more often. We wanted to reduce the number of defects, less waste. In this context, it was about kind of less wasted time, less time on kind of manual activities, or less wasted time on some of the bureaucracy. We had strategies around prioritization, collaboration, and flow. Our tactics were around focusing on improving product management, getting some agile basics, fundamentals in place, developing better automation, and looking at how we did cross-skilling. And then kind of for standard things we measured for evidence, we wanted to improve productivity, responsiveness, predictability, quality, and value. These dots in the matrices then allowed us to talk about and agree, or make sure we were aligned on how these fitted together. So a solid dot meant that we have a strong or a direct relationship between two of these elements. So we think there's a really strong relationship with each other and they're going to directly influence each other. Or an empty dot means there's some sort of relationship. It's kind of weaker, but probably indirect. And then if we have an empty square here, it means there's no we don't think there's any relationship at all. So at the top here, we said that if we invest in cross-skilling, and by cross-skilling, people have a wider variety of skills, so that work doesn't have to wait for a specific individual, or there's only one person that knows how to do a particular task or understands a particular technology. If we improve cross-skilling, then that's going to improve flow directly, because work's going to get blocks less. People can pick up new work when it comes in more quickly. So we think there's a direct correlation there. And then the empty dot down here, we think if we improve flow, it might help with fewer defects because we're going to get some faster feedback, but we don't think there's a direct relationship in there. So some correlation, but it's not a strong correlation. So across the whole matrix, then we can start having these conversations around: do we agree? Do we understand? Are we aligned on why we're doing these things? How we're going to go about achieving them? What impact they are going to have on our measures? How that's going to help us achieve our long-term aspirations and ultimately move us towards our true north. So that's the X matrix in a nutshell. It's not just about, it's kind of just want to emphasize this at the end, it's not just about that template and filling in that template and saying, great, we've got an X matrix, go off and implement this. It's about the conversations and the questions that happen. So this is a very old picture of my daughter, but it's very, very blurred. But I like it as an example of this quote from Thomas Jackson's book on the X Matrix. So it's the memory of what was said and felt that creates the alignment, not the final piece of paper. So the idea here is using the X Matrix and using the taste framework to talk to people and have these conversations around: do we know what we're doing? Do we know why we're doing things? Do we understand how we know how we're going to measure progress? How we know whether what we're doing is working? Do we understand what success is going to look like at the end of this? And if we're all aligned on that, great, we can probably then visualize that on the X matrix. But what quite often happens is people don't agree. So somebody will think there's some correlation between a few elements, and somebody else will think there's no correlation. And that usually creates a great conversation around what people's understanding is of a tactic or a strategy, and what fits where and how they relate to each other. And then that iterative process of getting the alignment and getting the agreement means that we now have a stronger understanding of all those things, what we're doing, why we're doing them. So it's not just the X matrix, it's the piece of paper. Sorry, it's not just the piece of paper, it's the conversations that people are having and the memory of those conversations that really creates the alignment. So I'll share these slides, but the template is there available for download. I've blogged about strategy deployment, and all my blog posts are on this link where I'll kind of go a lot deeper into this. And then obviously I have to plug my training courses. So there's a link there with a link to the training courses that I'm doing with Jim Benson at the moment. So managed to keep it to 20 minutes. That was a kind of very, very quick intro, but yeah, hopefully just enough to get a feel for what the X matrix is, and comments, questions.
Thank you, Karl. So I wanted to ask you actually two questions, which you can almost guess. I know you have been in the field for a long term. So what have you noticed? I mean, what are the things changing at the moment around the topic of strategy, portfolio transformation that you talk about? Have you noticed anything changing? Or
I mean, I guess what I noticed is that still within the agile world, transformation is still seen as a project. Like, we go in, we get some consultants, we do the transformation, and then it's done. And we're going to implement this framework, or we're going to implement this blueprint. And I guess what I'm trying to do with the X Matrix is try and kind of push back on that and say, well, actually, we don't have to pre-decide up front what we're going to do. Let's just think about what small things, what's our first tactic, and let's make sure we understand why we're doing that. So I guess what I notice is, again, if you go into organizations and start asking what's our strategy behind this transformation, there's not a good answer. Actually, people are not very good at strategy. That you get a lot of kind of woolly, fluffy strategy, or our strategy is to be agile. Well, okay, why did we choose that as a strategy? How's that going to help us? So if people haven't really thought, there's no, I don't think any kind of good discipline in strategic thinking, particularly in the agile world. Maybe outside of the agile world, but I don't see it in the agile transformation. So I'm trying to bring that in, so that and actually the customer I'm working with at the moment, they are trying to can be quite prescriptive about how they want to go agile, and we're going to implement value streams and we're going to do OKRs. And the bit of the organizer I'm working with, we're not doing value streams, and we kind of have some OKRs, but what I'm talking to them about is, well, actually, what are our challenges? What mess are we in? What do we want to address first? What ideas do we have to addressing them? Let's try some of that. How are we going to know whether that's working or not? And I'm not doing an explicit X matrix with them. If I asked them what an X matrix, they wouldn't know. But it's that kind of framework that I use in my head to have these conversations with them.
Thank you. Well, let's open it up. Tom, you had a question in the chat. Do you like to open it up yourself?
Not really, but I will if you force me to.
No. It's if you want it. Do you want me to read it up?
Yes, thanks.
So Tom is asking, what if you have multiple and each critical true north objectives in clear conflict for resources? So if you have multiple true north objectives, and there is a conflict of how they consume resources, is that correct rephrase, Tom?
I guess I've never had multiple true north objectives. I've just always been trying to get to a true north. Or if there's a disagreement on true north objectives, this is gonna surface that, and then you can have that conversation. I mean, I guess I generally think within a scope that you're going to do this, you would want to have a single true north that everyone's heading towards. That's my kind of take on that. Do you
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
do you agree or disagree? I'm
My
not.
my maybe if you have really large systems like national health, you tend to get more such conflicts. And if you're dealing with something tractably small, you might easily be able to settle on a true north. So I get that.
Mhm. Yeah, it's possible that I generally, yeah, where I'm working, I'm generally kind of within a relatively more local scope. Um, but I still think if I ever kind of hit that point, you would want to have that, you'd want to surface that contradiction if there is one.
If you have some
I,
questions as well, do you want to open them up?
I saw Dave put something in the chat, so I can definitely respond to that. So do I assume that strategy is preset and articulated? No. I certainly not preset. I think you want to. I think there's an articulation of what we currently think the strategy is, and that can come from anywhere. But equally, once it's set, that doesn't mean it's fixed. So I definitely I have a preference for emergent strategy. I don't think there's a conflict between the X matrix. Well, the way I use the X matrix and strategy and the taste framework, I don't think there's conflict between that and the idea of emergent strategy.
But at some stage, you've got to articulate it. So I mean, that relates
Yeah,
to the second workshop. You're negotiating things here in workshops. Is that a fair statement?
yeah, I think so. Yeah. So I can imagine. So I kind of tie it into to the work you're doing and something like SGRAN mapping. I think and admittedly, I've not had the chance to do this yet, but I think out of something like an S-Rhine mapping session, you would decide which things you're going to focus on and which things you're not going to focus on. Those things that you're choosing to focus on form your strategy.
Well, yeah, in an astro map, you'd focus on changing the substrate, not on focusing on a strategy. An astro map is a substrate in which strategy takes place, not the strategy itself.
But you're choosing where in that substrate to focus, are you not?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I'm trying to get. I mean, it seems to me that there's a big question here. It's a question for most people in strategy, is they end up with a body of words on a flip chart somewhere, and say that gives them a sense of direction. And that's what I and others are now really challenging, because we've had decades of it and it hasn't worked. So I'm trying to see if you've got a way around that. That's really cool.
I don't. I guess I don't think there's a conflict there. So I agree that yeah, we're not trying to. So I was chatting with Martin earlier. The idea of alignment, to me, alignment is towards a true north. That kind of sets the sense of direction, but you're not aligning to any specific tactic or solution. So this helps articulate that, and I think articulating it helps with that alignment, and gives people then the freedom to kind of decide what they want to do and decide how they want to solve some of these problems.
And I'd still like to hear something more specific, because, okay, you can say we're not trying to get to the North Star, we're using the North Star to align where we are, right?
Hmm.
But if you're navigating, that means you have got an idea of where you want to go. The navigation aid is to get you there.
Yeah.
All right. So how are you defining that? And you're focusing on outcome-based results. Yeah.
Yes. So potentially this is
That example, Carl, if we talk about alignment, we talk about shortening the interactions without a destination, so that people stay aligned, but they don't have a destination. They keep aligned by their interactions. For example, that's one of the changes we're starting to make.
Okay.
But I'm trying to work out, and the more I hear about what, and I don't like the true north expression, if I'm honest. Right, I've never liked it.
I know you don't.
Yeah, and I'm not saying you anything you don't already know, but I'm trying to come down to something really practical. How do you agree what true north is, or what true north is navigating you to?
Yeah, it's a so I don't necessarily define how to do that. I think there's a whole bunch of things though. I think there's stuff you could do with from probably SRN mapping, although I've not done it. Some things, agenda shift techniques. I think there's a whole. That's kind of why there's. I think there's. I don't think of strategy deployment as a specific process, but it's that idea of a framework that then helps you figure some of this stuff out. So yeah, I mean, I guess yeah, I'm not going down to that level of detail.
So I think that comes back to where I started. I mean, I can see that with a lean background. It's kind of like, we got this thing we got to do. How do we most effectively do it, rather than what is the thing we should do? That's how it comes across to me. Yeah, so somebody has set a direction of travel. Yeah, somebody has set a strategy for the company. We're in IT, we're in operations. We've got to make this work in the most effective way possible, and we've got a degree of latitude about what we do. So it's that task completion aspect that it looks like the X matrix comes in on. Yeah.
I read something else into the matrix, which I think is powerful, is that it's a way of reconciling different views to be consistent. So it's also a check that things are adding up more than where they are taking you to, which is an important aspect.
Yeah, I must admit, my inclination is to increase conflict in strategy, not decrease it. Because if you decrease strategy, you want to increase the sensory capability of the system. And you get more sensory capability in conflict than without conflict.
Couldn't you argue that in your attempt to do the reconciliation, you will actually find deviation?
You could argue it.
Yeah, well, I guess I found that that common conversation around the X matrix and specifically the correlations is what creates that conflict. That when it works well, and when it doesn't work well is when people just want to go in and make it nice and neat, and tidy and not have that conflict.
I'm not sure about the order of the hands, but whoever raised the hand first, please go ahead. Maybe it's you, Aaron. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I've been using Hoshin Kanri a long time and at work, and I guess I don't see all the problems with its use, because basically your implementation or execution occurs through the mapping on a Kanban board, and you can track all your visual progress and the breakdown of the goals. And when it comes to, and I mean, to be very specific, we use it by vertical segment. So anything that is a P&L or segment structure, that has, an annual target, forecast target for growth, or a business line, business unit, I've used them a huge part of, maybe at least half my career in the last 25 years. And I've seen the workshops work well, the quarterly kind of re-summaries, based on any kind of change that's happened, whether it's an outside-in impact because there's a market change by a competitor, or by some shift in the market, regulation, whatever, or something internal because there's been a shift in resources or priority. So yeah, I mean, I think it fits pretty neatly into the normal, we'll just say broad lean toolkits, Kaizen toolkits. And I've really not seen sort of a lot of challenges in that. And you get a huge, you surface, assuming workshop design is built around it effectively, which probably is the only way you're going to effectively do that. And we'll do audits to make sure all the parties are in there, and that there's appropriate representation. But it lines to your annual objectives, your top level improvement priorities, like what's been set as overall top level policy, and you use it up there also, and then the targets to improve, and then how it links to, let's say 2 to 4 year, or 2 to 3, or whatever your breakthrough objectives that you have on the bottom. And it tends to give people a compass, because when they surface other things throughout the year, if it's not in there, you have to have some kind of business case to justify knocking something else out, because there's such a impact on the existing priorities that have been established, or the existing objectives, which I've seen happen. But it's you get rid of a lot of the fluff, is what I've seen.
Yep.
So that's great. So I agree with his presentation.
Actually, so I mean, maybe one thing I didn't say is the X matrix itself is not my invention. That is a thing that's, well, it might not be obvious to some people. So the taste of applying the taste framework and using that language is I kind of claim credit for that. And it's my attempt. Dave might disagree with me. It's my attempt to try and make the X matrix a little bit more complexity informed. So a little bit more kind of manufacturing deterministic processing, and try and make it like, well, how can we align people and enable people to come up with the problems, to come up with their own solutions to problems, without having these kind of big transformation projects that have no flexibility at all with them, and end up making things worse quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, we completely agreed with that. I ban the word transformation for all time.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why I always talk about, I always try and talk about continuous transformation. I think there's still transformation going on. It's not a one-off project, but that's another argument for another day, probably.
So hooking on to what Aaron said, I'm curious to what would be the trigger points for back brief or feedback to, let's say we have a strategy development thingy ongoing at some level of a company, and then you have the strategy deployment that you talk about with Taste and the X Matrix. Do you use some kind of cadence there? When do you meet and talk about these things? Is it, monthly, quarterly, or do you have trigger points where what Aaron mentioned, well, we have a new initiative coming in here. How do you handle that? What's your experience there? That would be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Yeah, so different levels of cadences. So I kind of think, well, one, I think of the X matrix and everything on the X matrix. It's all hypothesis. So your true north is a hypothesis. Your aspirations are a hypothesis. This is what we think. So let's go. And we're not trying to predefine. So you then end up with these nested cadences as testing the hypothesis. So if your aspirations are a thing we want to achieve on a yearly basis, your yearly cycle that's very slow feedback. So how can you get quicker feedback on that? Then you've maybe got a quarterly cadence in there to just look at your strategies and how those strategies are working. Are they right ones? Have you learned anything? Do you need to change anything? And then that's usually looking at the evidence. And then once you get into your tactics, then you into your monthly or 2 weekly, or you get down to if you're doing this with agile teams, you get into your sprint cadence. So all those different cadences start aligning up with them. So there's almost kind of alignment across different time horizons as well. So what something like back briefing comes into it. Then as you take a tactic, we want to put together form a team who's going to work on that tactic. We put a team together and then we do back briefing with that team. So do they understand their brief, their mission? Do they understand the context? Do they understand the intent? Do they have the skills, resources, whatever they need do they think to be able to meet their mission? What's success and failure going to look like for them? What are their plans? What are their hypotheses? And brief that back. One that kind of helps us with that alignment, gives us some feedback. And then we can then have cadences with that team on what progress they're making. Does that answer the question? Or start to answer the question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Karl. So then, if there's something major popping up, like what Aaron mentioned, if there's some kind of signal that, well, this overall strategy you're working towards, that could happen anytime, right? Potentially. So how would you capture that typically?
So if you got cadence in place, it would come up through one of the monthly or the quarterly cadences. So you wouldn't necessarily want to wait to the end of the quarter, but when I started doing this when I was working at Rally Software. And was kind of we started experiment with the X Matrix there as a way we were doing strategy and strategy deployment within Rally. Actually, at the end of one quarter, so we used to do strategy planning at the start of the year, where we'd kind of set the true north and kind of do that initial kind of this is what we think we need to do. This is what we think we're going to do it. End of the first quarter, it was clear that the strategy was wrong. There was something better, different that we should be doing, and we kind of had to kind of redo the strategy. So that's an example where the strategy wasn't fixed. We learned something during the quarter that got fed back through that quarterly steering cadence to make a change and do the update. And actually, what we then started doing was doing a little bit more preparation of the strategy. Preparation is probably not the right word, but understanding and trying to get that learning cycle going with the strategy before the start of the year to try and minimize that. So trying to get a bit ahead of the game.
Just to be very wicked on this, all right, Karl, and you know this,
yeah.
you know my views of Rally, right? Was
yeah.
that because they were incompetent at creating strategy in the first place, or they were purely opportunistic? If anything changed, they wanted to jump on the latest bandwagon? Or was it genuinely a reworking?
Um, it wasn't a bandwagon. So it
They moved
was.
over to safe so fast, it was unbelievable.
Oh yeah, yeah, it was. It wasn't. No, it wasn't around. It wasn't that, and that probably was opportunistic. But it was. Well, it might have been safe related. It was around spotting an opportunity around the portfolio management market. So typically, Safe had been typically Rally had been kind of that team level tool with a bit of portfolio stuff. I think they saw an opportunity that they'd missed to pivot, or sorry, to double down onto some of that portfolio level stuff. Now that might have been driven by Safe. It was a long time ago now. I can't remember.
I think there's an interesting phenomenon here, though. I think when most people in Agile talk about strategy, they're talking about responding to market events on bigger movements. So it's how do we become more agile? How do we do an agile transformation? It's task-based. Or they're responding to IT implementation as a direction from corporate strategy. You find very, very few people in Agile who's ever sat in corporate strategy. Yeah, they've always sat at the implementation side. And I think the strength of methods like this, by the way, and the strength of Agile, is it focuses on task implementation. But I think we need to be really careful about confusing task implementation with strategy.
Yes. Um, so what I see, yeah, see a lot of Agile of task implementation, but there's no strategy behind that task implementation. So it just becomes this is what a consultant told us to do, or this is what the best practice is, or this is what I occurred at the most recent conference I went to. So it's that kind of
You're really
decision
lucky.
making and trade-off process.
If you're really lucky, I read a book on strategy 5 years ago and I half remember it. So now I'm an expert on the field. All right. So there's various phenomena within the Agile community.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think that it's interesting. A lot of our work at the moment is how do you combine tactics and grand strategy in the same frameworks? Yeah,
Hmm.
because what we're trying to do is to try and get that tactical focus, but get it into a messy entanglement with strategy itself from multiple sources. So I think one of the issues, and I think and I'm curious on the X matrix, all right, I'm not asking questions, I'm curious, is how do you break the linearity of your process? So taste is a linear process. Yeah, so how do you break that linearity, or how do you break it? Not on,
I I don't think taste is a linear process. I'm gonna argue that one. And it's because it's the correlations. So when I was putting the slide together with the arrows going around, I was thinking, I wonder if anybody calls this a loop. Um, I don't. I think there's relationships in there, but those matrices mean it's a many to many, which means it's not. To me, that's what one of the things that the X matrix adds is what we're not saying is here's our strategy and here's how we're going to implement this strategy, and that's when you kind of get that direct linear relationship. It's we have a number of strategies, number of things we want to focus on. We have a number of tasks, but any specific tactic might help implement a number of strategies. And any strategy might have a number of tactics.
So the language is important there. So we have a number of
Hmm.
tasks. Yeah, we can define a direction of travel of those tasks. We may do those tasks in parallel. They may interact. We may be prepared to change them. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's taking place within a strategy substrate. And if
Uh,
if you've got a really valuable task completion skill here, which can feed back that, and looking to collect those methods, all right.
mhm.
But I don't see this as determining initial strategy.
No, no,
Yeah.
no. So this is no, you're right. This is trying to visualize the landscape, the full landscape of the strategy. I might be using the wrong word, landscape wrong there, but it's understanding what our tactics are and what our strategies are and what the relationship is between those tactics and strategies. So yeah, it's not strategy development or tech development, it's visualization of
Got it.
those different elements and how they relate to each other.
That's cool. That's what I thought. I saw value in that, but I just wanted to check I wasn't missing something.
Yeah, yeah, no, this
This is
is that, and
exactly.
that's why I definitely make a distinction. I'm not, I don't claim to be an expert in strategy development, But
I think this is super important because some people will call it strategy deployment, some will call it strategy execution. So I think that this is a valid method for people to see how things. I mean, as you say, it's visualization of the strategy execution or the strategy deployment. It's not strategy development. It's not how to make the choices. If you look at Roger Martin or any other, well, not any other, but Roger Martin, for instance. I mean, he talks about making those choices of direction and talking about your winning aspiration. So that would be the strategy development part, making those choices and shaping, not only reacting, but actively shaping the landscape as well.
Seeking balance, right? So it's a balancing activity.
Yeah, you need both.
Yeah.
You need the strategy development and you need the strategy deployment, and it's two sides of the coin, and you need to make them connected so you don't have a brain and a body executing. So that's why I asked about the back brief and how it's connected, because normally in many companies you have someone doing the strategy work and others who just execute it, and that's not where we want to be. That doesn't work anymore.
The way Martin sets out strategy, that's probably the only way it could work.
Yeah, because it's feedback loops all the way.
And it's why it's coherent. So and that's why Dave, I love the way you kind of describe messy coherence, and I think you used the metaphor of the spider's web where it hangs together, but there's holes in it. You know, an X matrix, you look at the pattern of those dots to show the relationships between the different things, and one of the things you're looking for is there any big gaps, big holes in here, or actually is it a little bit too just solid dots everywhere,
And I think
and it's not got enough flexibility.
really important. I was on a big conference call with Delia before this. We're looking at how do we measure cognitive capability in companies and the balance with AI, which we're going to launch something on shortly. Because the evidence now is use of AI destroys cognitive capability. Yeah, and actually does it quite quickly. So we're looking at measuring for that. But one of the things we were talking about, and I think it's the key phrase in the visualization, I think I'd start with the visualization, not the build-up, is human beings respond to patterns, they don't respond to precision. And part of the problem with most strategy and tactics is it attempts to make things too precise too quickly.
Yeah.
And therefore that doesn't work with the way human beings have evolved to handle things. So the more you can create patterns of interaction or visual patterns, I think the more coherence you can achieve. The more, ironically, and I think this is interesting, Bizakov says this in his classic paper, is the more data you get, and the more, if you can't, if you think you get the right data or you get more data, you haven't understood strategy. It's a brilliant, it's 5 points are brilliant. Yeah, in fact, I put them in yesterday's blog post. And the danger is we don't understand that ability to navigate uncertainty. Right? And patterns are a key way in which we navigate. But my worry with North Star is it means we may be in a magnetic field and we may need to go in a completely different direction. And that's my point about alignment. We need to hold things together while we move in a completely different direction with very little notice. And that's always been my problem with systems thinking in Sengi. It deals with uncertainty by defining a future state rather than defining interactions in the present state. Yeah. So if you manage uncertainty by defining a future state, if the future state isn't the right state, you've got a real problem on your hands. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that's so potentially that's the problem. So the problem with the North Star, the true North, as an analogy, is that is fixed and doesn't change.
Yeah.
Whereas in the context I'm using it, you might redefine your true North based on learning. Is like we were going in this direction, actually we're not going in this direction. So that's where the metaphor breaks, I guess.
Isn't it also a sign that in a way the X matrix helps you summarize your view on the current situation, that things add up, which is actually a process that in itself helps you to see reasons why it don't, and you might have to change aspects, including your perception of the direction of travel. I think this is actually beautiful. It's the strongest element. It's the balancing act, right? So it's in trying to find balance that you realize that you need to rebalance.
if you put time as a third dimension?
I've been thinking about the time aspect of it recently because somebody said it aligns time horizons. So, and I
You're also
might blog
looking at the
about,
whole Kairos Chronos thing as well, which is really important.
yeah, and yeah, I've not got my head around that yet, but so the true north is the longer term, and then as you move through aspirations, strategies, tactics, evidence, you're kind of getting closer to the nearer term because the evidence is your kind of leading metrics and what's happening now. Yeah, I'm not. That's something that's just
the Horizons heresy.
So there is a hunch on this one actually, because strategy needs to be actionable, which it means it needs to be relevant, which actually imply a time horizon.
Or again, to quote Akov, strategy may be about inaction. Inaction is often harder than action.
Yeah, sure, but that would still happen in some perceived time frame, depending on your context.
Aaron's had his hand up for a long time.
Aaron is a very patient man. Please go ahead.
Yep. No, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, I mean, the majority of organizations that are, or companies, if it's a commercial firm, their true north is not radically changing on a regular basis, and especially I would say in the last 3 years, you know, and it doesn't look like a lot is
technology.
Aaron, you're losing
fundamentally. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. That there's always a technology component, but it's an enabler. But fundamentally, if it's any kind of public firm or any firm with that has, let's say, substantial size and weight, the optimization and the running around the P&L is sort of fundamental, right? You're not dislodging that inside you know, the operationalized true north. You could argue that it shouldn't be there. You could argue that shouldn't be what people are incentivized on and on and on. But you know, I think P&L shareholder prioritization is 100-0 on a pretty regularized basis. Then you tend to have either some part of market leadership or market positioning or market share, which then tends to govern a lot of the, we'll call it investment bets, which however big or small they are and how you calibrate them. One of the reasons I found that Hoshinkan Re, and I believe that your taste approach works with that really well, is that a lot of those 2 or 3 or 4 foundational true norths really don't change very often. You know, there's very few firms, by the exception, that you're going to find that aren't going to be defining a big chunk of their true north around margin. And we might not like to talk about that. We can go weeks and months and lots of presentations that never bring up margin, but it's really fundamental. And then that bends into, well, what's the customer type and or the customer pattern that's necessary to sustain that margin? And then how does our operating model, in essence, gear around that? And then you have whatever technology enablers or net new product or market shifting components in there. And we can argue that those are wrong, but that's been pretty consistent for now quite a while. I would say probably several decades. And the culture is defined that way. So that's how I sort of, you know, all I've ever seen is that there's just a little bit of portfolio mashing going on when it comes to most of those variables, but you're not throwing those out every year and coming up with 5 new ones. I mean, I've never seen any, you know, let's say medium to larger enterprises that are doing that or will do that or can do that because their whole economic model is built around it.
But even that is a strategic choice. Look at Amazon.
Absolutely.
I mean, So you could do things differently, and that to me is strategy, to make those choices. Are we going to operate as everyone else, or are we going to be radically different? Take Amazon, for instance. They made a choice.
Yeah, but also remember how unique those choices were in their inception to becoming a large sustaining business. Once you already have a large sustaining business, which is where the majority of businesses are that we're talking about, you don't get those reinception points. You could say you're going to carve out a JV, you could carve out some spinoffs, you could do some things. That's absolutely true. But your core cash flow driven businesses tend not to have those opportunities to sort of reset back to zero or start at that small point. The other fundamental issue is that the play of pure technology firms, or firms that become pure technology firms, because that's what I would argue started as Amazon's evolution. They started as an e-commerce firm, which you could say was sort of technology pure, but not really, right? It was highly dependent on consumer. Basically, it was CPG through omnichannel, to then become a technology firm. That's a pretty substantial leap that very few firms, mid or large firms, will make wholeheartedly, because the CapEx you're talking about to be disruptive enough to have that position is so astronomical that it's unrealistic they're going to raise it.
An important point here, right? So, and I think most companies who've been very successful, when they describe their past and describe their strategic choices, in the main, I think, are living in a fictional world. It's heavy retrospective coherence. It was mostly serendipity, like Amazon Web Service, which was purely serendipity. It started to work, they exploited.
Yeah.
I think the other issue you've got now is, if you look at the way the banks funded Twitter, Musk's acquisition of Twitter, there was no rational reason for that, but there was enough momentum that they felt they had to go along with it. And I think now you've got fewer bigger companies. And those companies are so big that they don't have to do much. And I think that's changing the strategic game, because it's like companies which are starting up in Silicon Valley are not starting up to change the world. They're starting up to be bought by a bigger company. Right. And that's a very different strategy. And I think that's a problem. And the interaction with government, if you look at the latest stuff on AI, the world is getting a lot more messy and entangled than it's ever been before. And we're going to have to rethink a lot of this stuff, is a basic principle here.
Yeah. You bring up a great point when it comes to, let's say, Twitter, that buy, or more importantly, I would say, is Amazon shift to AWS. So let's say in the 2001, 2, 3, 4 range, when Amazon was still blending their roll their own Linux stack while licensing Oracle, right? Because that's the real history. Let's say Oracle said, you know what, we love you so much, we're going to do a balance of trade deal with you. Here's $100 million on top of, here's our software for 20 years for free. Here's the, here's the share drive. Download whatever you want, whenever you want. How much would they have still built something called AWS? They absolutely would have. But what would have the velocity been? The velocity would have been radically different. And you would have seen a different thing called Amazon. They'd still be big. They'd still have that Walmart part of the business that would be massive. It might even be bigger, actually, because that would be what they lean on. But the AWS business would probably be more like Google's GCP business, right? A distant third place, because they wouldn't have needed it as much, right? Or by the time they needed it, the hurdle cost would have been, quite substantial.
I sat in IBM strategy, all right, and I've done stuff. I would say everything I've observed in all my years in strategy is it's 99% serendipity with post hoc rationalization. So given that, the thing is to manage for an environment in which serendipity is more likely to happen. Yeah, and I think that, to me, that's part of this new dynamics of strategy we've got to think about. Yeah.
We're at the top of the hour. Karl, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your point of view. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah,
I've,
thank you, Karl. Are you going to put the slide up in the chat or on the meetup or something?
I'll put a link to it in the meetup.
Yeah, so if you share the link with
Yeah.
me, Karl, I'll distribute it together with the
Okay.
recording. And you can always find past recordings from the past invites on Meetup and in many other places where we try to put. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great job, Karl. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Great.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.